Hey everyone, welcome to the public workshop and fulfillment of SB1 requirements. We're going to take a couple of minutes for folks to log in and then we will get started. Thank you. Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to our public workshop and fulfillment of Senate Bill 1 requirements to evaluate emissions reduction needs from commercial motor vehicles. Before starting the presentation, our division chief at the Air Quality Planning and Science Division, Michael Benjamin, will say a few words.
Thank you, Sarah. As Sarah said, my name is Michael Benjamin. I'm chief of the Air Quality Planning and Science Division at the California Air Resources Board. And my staff have been leading the effort to evaluate some of the elements of SB1, especially related to the turnover of heavy-duty vehicles. I want to thank all of you who joined this morning for your participation. It's really important to have your engagement, to get your input, to hear your thoughts about what we're doing. As Sarah said, one of the elements of SB1 was that we hold this public workshop to solicit input on a report that we're developing that describes the impact of the provisions in SB1 for commercial heavy-duty vehicles, and specifically what the impacts of those vehicles are on air quality. SB1 provided for over $50 billion in funds for highway improvements, and it also included these provisions or these requirements for CARB to do the report that we're going to be talking about today. In today's workshop, we will be presenting preliminary analysis, and this will be a presentation that is done jointly by CARB staff in conjunction with researchers from the University of California, led by the University of California at Berkeley. This is really, I think, not only is today's workshop something that we're doing because we're required to by the legislature under the provisions of SB1, but it's also a really great opportunity for us here at CARB to get input from you all on how CARB is moving forward to meet our air quality goals and how we transition to a zero emission future for commercial vehicles, for heavy duty commercial vehicles. In doing outreach for the workshop, we've tried to be comprehensive and reach out to a wide group of stakeholders. So I'm hoping that we do have that representation here today and that we hear from all of you. And that includes engine and technology manufacturers, representatives from the trucking industry, I hope, and community and environmental justice groups, as well as air districts, ports, and other local groups. So I just want to say I'm really looking forward to today's workshop. I really appreciate all of you for your interest, for your engagement, and for your participation today. And with that, I will hand it back to Sarah.
Thank you, Michael. Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Forestieri, and I work on emissions inventory in CARB's Air Quality Planning and Science Division. And again, welcome to our workshop. Before diving in, here are some logistics for the Zoom workshop. If you're calling in by phone today, you can use the call-in information and access code in the first 2 bullet points. And then for questions, we're asking everyone to either use the raise hand feature if you're using the Zoom app, or on the phone, you can enter in #2 to raise your hand and *6 to mute and unmute There will be two presentations, as Michael alluded to, one from CARB that I will be presenting and another from our contractor at the University of California. We will be presenting a summary of CARB's heavy-duty regulations, an overview of SB1 compliance rates with the truck and bus regulation, and an overview of our key state and local air quality goals, our plan to evaluate the impact of SB1 provisions on air quality goals, and so that will be the focus of our extramural contract and next steps. So the first part I'm going to be talking about here is the truck and bus regulation, an overview of that, and an approach to meet the SB1 requirements. So CARB has adopted many fleet rules, including the drayage truck regulation, which have been critical for improving air quality in California. One very important regulation that we will be discussing in a lot of detail today is our truck and bus regulation, which gradually requires diesel fueled vehicles with GVWR, or gross vehicle weight rating, greater than 14,000 pounds, operating in California to upgrade to 2010 or newer model year engines by January 1st, 2023. So this kind of has like a phase in. So there's PM filter requirements, like retrofits for diesel particulate filters that started in January 1st, 2012, and then beginning in January 1st, 2015, there were the model year 2010 engine requirements or upgrades. So currently, since we're in year 2022, model year 2007 to 2009 and newer are currently compliant with truck and bus regulation, but by the end of 2022, these must be turned over to 2010 or newer engine model year. So here's some background on Senate Bill 1. It is a large transportation funding bill. It was signed by Governor Brown on April 28, 2017. It is referred to as the Road Repair and Accountability Act, but we are going to be referring to it as SB1 in this presentation. It is a transportation funding bill that invests $54 billion into California roads, freeways, bridges, transit, and safety. And it also includes some key provisions for commercial vehicles. Drilling down on commercial vehicle provisions, and then please note here that not all heavy-duty vehicles are commercial, such as shuttle buses, for example. The first provision is that it authorizes the California Department of Motor Vehicles, or also known as DMV, to put registration holds on vehicles that are not compliant with CARB's truck and bus regulation. And then the second provision that we're really going to be focusing on today is a useful life period that prevents CARB from requiring the retirement, retrofit, or repower until the later of the following time periods. So the first one is 13 years from the model year the engine and emission control system are first certified. And then the second is when the vehicle reaches the earlier of 800,000 vehicle miles traveled, or 18 years from the model year the engine and emission control system are first certified. So SB1 specifically directs CARB by January 1st, 2025 to report to the legislature on the impact of the useful life provisions on state and local clean air goals, and needs to include a compliance rate assessment of truck and bus. In addition, CARB must also hold at least one public workshop on this effort. In addition to reporting on useful life impacts, SB1 also directed CARB to make recommendations to the legislature on additional or different mechanisms for achieving those goals. So CARB will include the following in the SB1 report: an evaluation of truck and bus compliance rates, an assessment of the impact of useful life provisions on state and local clean air goals, its sensitivity to useful life provisions, and then finally an evaluation of tools and policies to achieve air quality goals. And this will be covered through our extramural contract. For the remainder of this presentation, we're going to present some preliminary analysis that we've done so far and next steps for completing different parts of the SB1 report. So here I'm starting with compliance rates of the truck and bus regulation. There are two key databases for assessing truck and bus compliance rates. First, there's the California DMV for California registered vehicles and the International Registration Plan, or IRP, for out-of-state vehicles. IRP is a registration reciprocity agreement between the contiguous United States and Canadian provinces and provides a listing of trucks and fleets reporting operation or mileage in California, but not operation in California for individual trucks within these fleets. So in other words, we know which vehicles are in IRP fleets operating in California, but we don't know which vehicles in these fleets actually visit California and how often. So there's two methods we're going to be looking at in this presentation for assessing compliance. In the first method, staff assessed compliance of all California registered vehicles in DMV and out-of-state vehicles in IRP fleets with mileage in California. And this is the method used in CARB's, And this is the method used in CARB's annual enforcement reports. The second method is automated license plate readers, or ALPR, and this involves the collection of video footage of vehicles operating on the road, combined with software that digitizes license plate characters. Data from these systems can be linked to vehicles in DMV and IRP to get model year and vehicle weight. This method provides individual vehicle level information on out-of-state trucks operating in California. However, our sample is limited by the number of ALPR systems we have deployed, and so this method may be less comprehensive than the first one. Over the past 6 years, compliance rates with the truck and bus regulation have increased over time. Shown here are aggregated statistics from CARB's annual enforcement reports for vehicles with 14,000 pounds gross vehicle weight rating or heavier, and this is based on registration data. The compliance rates for California vehicles are in blue, and the out-of-state registered vehicle compliance rates are shown here in red. You can see that starting in 2020, when DMV registration holds for non-compliant vehicles took effect, there's kind of this jump up in compliance rates. And then out-of-state compliance rates in red, have steadily increased over time, but kind of exhibit a different behavior. The overall combined compliance rates for both California and out-of-state registered vehicles in 2021 is 94%. Compliance can also be assessed, as I mentioned before, through ALPR data. As part of an extramural contract, CARB deployed 7 ALPR systems at major gateways to California within the Los Angeles area to assess truck and bus compliance rates. I consider data collected from January to May 2022 with 1.4 million plate reads. Like enforcement reports, we see similarly high compliance rates for both California registered vehicles at 99% compliance and out-of-state vehicles at 96%. To recap, our analysis of truck and bus compliance assessment shows high compliance rates using 2 different methods, especially for California registered vehicles. The success of truck and bus over the last 5 years is a testament to the hard work of CARB staff across the agency conducting outreach, implementing new laws, including SB1, and streamlining enforcement. We will continue to track and report back on compliance rates through the end of 2022, which is the major deadline for this regulation. And in addition to that, we will evaluate some of the reasons for non-compliance, especially for fleet groups with lower compliance rates. So we're going to pause here for questions, and please try to keep your comments and questions within 2 minutes. I just want to note that there will be several other opportunities later on within the workshop to ask questions. Thank you. And I will set up the Q&A.
Okay, Olivia, can you call on folks with raised hands?
All right, it looks like we have one person with a raised hand. So Tim Garrett, I will now unmute you and you should be able to unmute your mic now.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I just had a question about the international registration plan. You said it was all the contiguous United States and the Canadian provinces. So I'm assuming that's correct. It doesn't include Mexican states. Is that right?
Yes, that is a great question, Tim, and that is correct. However, the vast majority of trucks visiting California from Mexico often have dual plates. That means they have a plate from Mexico and a plate from California. So they would be in our California database.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, it looks like we have another hand raised. Laurel Moorhead, I'm going to unmute you. You should be able to unmute yourself now.
Hi, I had a question about the truck and bus regulation. I was under the impression that that was going to apply to all vehicles entering California, not just vehicles registered in California. Is that correct?
Hi, Laurel. Yeah, thanks for your question. And that is absolutely correct. It is a fleet rule that applies to all vehicles operating in California. And so you can see from some of the previous slides that we did assess compliance rates for both California registered and out of state. One, big distinction or, important factor for the compliance rates of California vehicles is that California registered vehicles have registration holds if they're not compliant, but that is not true for out of state vehicles. But to answer your question overall, it does apply to both out of state and California registered.
All right. There's no other hands raised at this time. There is a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I just want to let everyone know that I'm going to drop the link to the presentation slides in the chat right now, and that way everyone can click on that link and find those presentation slides. I think that's our only question right now in the Q&A. So I think we could probably move on, Sarah.
Okay, sure thing.
Okay, I'll go to the next slide for you, and then I will hand it back to you. Oops. Okay, Sarah, I handed it back over to you. And you should be able to share your screen with your slides now.
So continuing on. Yeah, thanks again for all of your questions. They're very good questions. Okay. So now we will turn our focus to upcoming state and local air quality goals. The state of California has an ambitious position of clean air requirements and climate goals that we are working on over the next 30 years. This is a timeline of implementation plans we need to meet the state and for South Coast and San Joaquin Valley, the two areas with the most challenging ozone and fine particulate air quality in the nation. There's also an immediate need to reduce emissions and exposure in the state's highly impacted, low-income, and disadvantaged communities. Climate goals include the midterm target in 2030 for 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions below 1990 levels, and longer-term targets in 2045 and 2045 for carbon neutrality, and by 2050 for greenhouse gases 80% below 1990 levels. Since 2018, CARB annually considers low-income and disadvantaged communities to begin new monitoring programs and community emission reduction programs, otherwise known as CERPs. These are developed through the coordination between CARB, local districts, and community groups and set
5 and 10-year targets to reduce community exposure. The targets of current SERPs adopted by the board begin in 2024, with many programs including a focus on the turnover of dirty mobile sources and their engines to zero emission technologies as sought by communities and their representatives. Another key goal that we consider is the Executive Order N7920. And this recognizes the severity of the climate crisis and the need for immediate action. Governor Newsom signed Executive Order N7920 on September 23rd, 2020, which established zero emission goals for mobile sources in California. Just focusing on the heavy duty on-road sector in particular, the governor's order set the goal to transition all drayage trucks to zero emission by 2035. And the remainder of medium and heavy duty vehicles to zero emission where feasible by 2045. As a result of CARB's many heavy duty regulations, pollutant emissions are projected to decrease over time. So here I'm considering heavy duty vehicles with class 4 through 8 or with gross vehicle weight rating greater than 14,000 pounds. These charts show statewide NOx and diesel particulate matter emissions in 2017 before the full phase-in of truck and bus in 2023. Before the full phase-in of truck and bus in 2017, in 2023 with the full phase-in of truck and bus, and in 2037 when other adopted regulations have significant impact. From 2017 to 2037, there is a 78% reduction in NOx emissions and a 91% reduction in diesel particulate matter. A large part of the SB1 report will explore ways to further reduce emissions from this sector. Reducing criteria and greenhouse gas pollutant emissions from the heavy duty sector is really crucial for meeting our air quality and climate goals. In addition to the adopted regulations I mentioned earlier, there are 2 key regulations under development, and this includes Advanced Clean Fleets, which has zero emission fleet requirements for high priority private, public drayage and federal fleets, and this will be considered by our board in October 2022. And then earlier this year, the EPA released a notice of proposed rulemaking for their heavy duty engine and vehicle standards, which reduces NOx emissions from federal combustion trucks operating in California. And this regulation will be considered in December 2022. Even with the current and under development regulations, there is still a need to further reduce heavy duty emissions by turning over old combustion trucks to zero emission technologies through the zero emission or ZE truck measure. CARB included the ZE truck measure as part of the 2022 state SIP strategy as part of state SIP measures. Even after the adoption of zero emission truck regulations like advanced clean trucks and advanced clean fleets, there will still be 480,000 combustion trucks on the road in 2037. This measure upgrades the remaining heavy duty combustion trucks that have reached the end of their useful life to zero emission trucks. So some options here for transitioning combustion fleets to zero emission include a flexible approach utilizing market tools like differentiated registration fees and green zones. And this creates an opportunity to encourage electrification for fleets in the best position to do so, some flexibility and potential funding for more zero emission trucks. But then this could also require new authorities. And then if new authorities are not granted, the second option is a requirement for all trucks to turn over once they reach the end of their useful life. One important air quality goal is the 70 parts per billion ozone standard in 2037, which is the focus of the 2022 state SIP strategy. Here is a bar chart of NOx emissions in Southwest Air Basin broken down by sector and an estimate of the carrying capacity, which is 60 tons per day. The leftmost bar shows the baseline emissions with adopted measures. The middle shows remaining emissions after CARB and district measures, and additional reductions from federal measures are shown on the right-hand side. The heavy-duty portion in green shows substantial emissions reductions with adopted under development regulations, district measures, as well as the zero emission truck measure. To understand the emissions impact of the zero emission truck measure specifically, I have zeroed in to the remaining heavy duty truck emissions with and without the zero emission truck measure. So the emissions without the zero emission truck measure are shown on the left-hand side, and with the zero emission truck measure are shown on the right-hand side. And these emissions are divided into 4 different groups. There are transit buses subject to the Innovative Clean Transit Rule in teal, fleets regulated by Advanced Clean Fleets in orange or ACF, and non-ACF fleets within the useful life period in lighter blue, and non-ACF fleets beyond their useful life period in dark blue. The zero emission truck measure turns over older vehicles that go beyond their useful life to zero emission, which is critical for the ozone standard in 2037. However, a good portion of the remaining emissions are from fleets within their useful life period that cannot be turned over through a regulation. If these fleets are transitioned to zero emission, it could have additional benefits, for example, in communities or in earlier SIP years. As part of the SB1 report, we will do a detailed analysis using the most up-to-date inventory assumptions in MFAC 2021, and also fleet information from DMV and IRP. We will run scenarios with this updated inventory, assessing the sensitivity to results with and without the useful life restrictions, and do an emissions assessment in both the statewide scale as well as the air basin level. So we will definitely be considering South Coast and San Joaquin Valley air basins, and assess what emissions benefits are possible in communities from reducing toxics like diesel particulate matter, for example. And I will pause here again for questions.
All right, thanks, Sarah. We do have a couple questions. And are you going to switch it over to me?
Yes,
Okay,
I am looking for.
All right, cool. Let me share my screen with those instructions. Okay. All right, so we do have a couple questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to go to those ones first. The first one is, what is the definition of commercial?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so if you look in the like legal definition of it, generally it's, you know, any vehicle that's used for, you know, business purposes. So this could be like, you know, a delivery truck or another type of vocation, but you know, trucks that are not commercial include, for example, like airport shuttle buses, and we can perhaps provide, you know, the more formal definition if you follow up with us if you're interested.
All right, cool. Yeah, maybe we can get that link and we can respond in the Q&A with that link to the more formal definition.
Yeah, sure thing.
Okay, great. And then our next question in the Q&A box is, when is the timeline for adoption of the ZE truck measure? So I think they're talking about ACF maybe.
So the ZE truck measure, so that was included in the draft state SIP strategy, and the timeline we have for that currently is a board hearing date sometime in 2028, and the regulation would likely start around the 2030 time frame.
Okay, great. And then what is the timeline for the ZET rule? So I think that's the same question. Okay, cool. All right, so let's move on to raised hands. So the first raised hand I have is Bill McGavern. So I'm going to allow you to talk now.
Yep, thanks. Good morning. This is Bill McGavern with Coalition for Clean Air. And I want to thank you for the presentation. For the most part, I thought it was very illuminating and clear. I do, though, take issue with the use of the word goals when it's applied to ambient air quality standards. It's not really adequate or accurate to refer to those standards as just goals. When we're talking about an executive order, sure, that's a goal. But when we're talking about the requirement that under the Clean Air Act, we attain national ambient air quality standards, those are binding, those are enforceable, and the word goals is really not sufficient. And I don't say that as a matter of nitpicky semantics. I say it to remind everyone of the context that we have in California, the worst air pollution in the country, whether we're talking about ozone or particulate matter. We are not on track to attain those air quality standards. The consequences, if we don't attain, include a loss of transportation funding, and more importantly, they include premature death and illness for thousands of Californians. So that context is important, because if we look at that bar graph that you presented that shows the NOx reductions from retiring trucks at the end of their useful life, those NOx reductions are huge. They'll make a real difference in the health of Californians. And really, to have any hope of attaining air quality standards, we have to exercise that option and retire those dirty old diesel trucks at the end of their useful lives. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bill, for your comment. And yeah, we will definitely take that feedback seriously about, the semantics of goals versus, the Clean Air Act. And that's one reason why we're going to be, doing detailed modeling at the air basin level, both in South Coast and San Joaquin Valley in key SIP years. So that's something we will be, tracking throughout this entire process. And yes, we do agree that, turning over those old combustion vehicles to zero emission is very key for meeting, the 2037 the ozone standard in 2037, for example, and our other goals as well. So yes, thank you very much for that comment.
Okay, so we do have another hand raised. Glenn Chu, I'm going to allow you to talk now.
Thank you. Glenn Cho from Toyota Motors North America. I had a question on slide number 23, Sarah. It says on the zero emission truck measures, you have two sub bullet points, 1 and 2, but maybe the clarification question I had is, both of them says requires new authorities. What do you mean by it requires new authority? Can you elaborate what that means?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, some of the things we're thinking about, like differentiated registration fees that make the total cost of ownership for combustion vehicles or old combustion vehicles less favorable and more favorable for zero emission, for example, will likely require legislation or something to give us new authority on that front, and that's just an example. We will really kind of do kind of a thorough or a very exploratory analysis to figure out what other tools could we need at this point. But yeah, some of them could require new authorities.
So legislative, basically the state government or the state legislature giving CARB the authority to kind of regulate these mechanisms, correct?
Yes, that is my understanding.
And then just to reinforce the previous question that was asked, the timeline for the zero emission measures is looking at around 2030 timeline?
Yes, that is the tentative timeline.
Okay,
that
thank
we're putting in the SIP.
Okay.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, I see, Bill, you have your hand raised again, so let me turn your mic back on. There you go.
Thanks very much. Just wanted to comment also, since the timeline came up, that I don't see why we're waiting until 2030 to require the retirement of these old diesel trucks. This is authority that the legislature already gave you. They, constrain the authority beyond useful life, but you can now require the retirement at the end of useful life. I don't know why you wouldn't bring that to the board until 2028. We have a pressing and urgent air pollution crisis. So, why are we waiting to take the dirtiest, oldest trucks off the road? A 2010 truck in 2030 is 20 years old. And a lot of these trucks are already polluting way beyond the levels that they were originally certified to. So I would urge that this come to the board in the next couple of years, and be ready to start that retirement as soon as those 2010 trucks reach the end of their useful life, which is 13 to 18 years or 800,000 miles. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment, Bill. Paul from the Advanced Clean Fleets team can respond to that.
Yeah, I can get started. And I think we do agree that we do want to move these measures forward as quickly as possible, but we do recognize also that we do have a good amount of regulatory analysis we need to do with each of them. So we do expect all these to be major regulations requiring a full economic analysis and to ensure we have a good, proper rulemaking analysis. So I think we want to move this as quickly as possible, and 2030 is just our initial estimate for what that'll take.
And we'll take this comment and have it something in the back of our mind as we're working through this report. Thank you for that.
Okay, we do have one more hand raised at this time. Brett Sanders, I've allowed you to unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to have this workshop. I just, I'm always kind of on the side of business, and and obviously there's a side of regulatory analysis, and we have to balance that. And it seems like all along I've tried to get balance in the regulations, and then we hear the useful life limitations, and big corporations are able to handle that, but small agencies, small businesses can't. There's got to be the balance. So I appreciate some of the comments to push forward, but you got to have the balance to analyze the economics of business. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, this is why we're looking into a variety of options, not just a straight requirement, but then also market tools as well. And then UC Berkeley is going to be talking more about that.
Thank you.
Okay, our next hand raised is Damon Conklin. I've allowed you to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. Damon Conklin with the League of California Cities. Just had a quick question regarding these regulations as it relates to, I guess it's more of a two-part question of just electrified fleet for emergency vehicles and how that reg applies to those larger than class 4 emergency vehicles. And then also just, is it technology neutral? I mean, does it also include hydrogen or is it electric specific?
Yeah, those are some great questions. I guess to your last point about electric versus hydrogen, as long as the zero tailpipe emissions, that is what we care most about, because that's the technology that's going to help us meet our air quality goals. And then for emergency vehicles, maybe we can have some of our rulemaking folks give their insights on, how emergency vehicles are treated and maybe the regs we have under development right now. But we don't have any specific plans fleshed out for them for the ZE truck measure in particular.
Yes, and some of this is part of our work we're doing at Advanced Clean Fleets, which isn't the topic of the day, but just to provide some background. When we're looking at requirements for public fleets or other fleets serving emergencies, we are adding provisions to help in cases of emergency response. So for Advanced Clean Fleets, we have provisions if vehicles aren't available or vehicles can't meet your needs. So if the vehicle's available, wouldn't be able to serve your what your fleet needs to do, there are provisions we're proposing with that. And we also are including provisions for mutual aid if a portion of your fleet needs to travel outside your service area for extended periods to help with issues across the state. So we are looking at those Advanced Clean Fleets. We probably will do something similar if we have future fleet rules similar to that. But this is all to be determined as part of these future measures.
Okay, so right now we don't have any more hands raised at this time. And there's also no questions in the Q&A. So Sarah, I can hand it back over to you if you're ready. And you're muted.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Here I should be sharing my screen again, and we will continue. So now we're going to move on to the evaluation of tools and policies to achieve air quality goals. So as some background on our extramural contract, this is a 2-year effort that kicked off in June and informs the development of the SB1 report. The contractor will drill down on potential strategies to further reduce emissions from the heavy-duty fleet. And this work really is complementary or ties into the ZE truck measure by exploring mechanisms, market, or incentives or other methods to most effectively turn over old trucks to zero emission. So I will now kick it over to Jim Sally to talk about their planned work on this effort.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, I think you can go ahead and advance to the next slide. So I'll just start by introducing myself and a couple people from our team. So I'm Jim Sally. I'm an economist on faculty at UC Berkeley. I'm the sort of lead researcher on this project. Mark Jacobson, who is also on the call here, is an economist on faculty at UC San Diego. Mark and I have both been working for a long time on policy analysis in the light duty vehicle fleet, primarily, as well as other areas around energy and environmental policy. And in particular have been doing some work together exploring turnover of light duty vehicle fleet to create environmental benefits and how to think about policies around that. And we are excited about translating some of those insights and approaches to this issue here. We'll have a team of researchers working with us. Also key on that is Andy Campbell, who's also on the call. Andy is the executive director of the Energy Institute at Haas here at UC Berkeley, and will be kind of leading much of our effort of kind of translating and thinking about getting this research out and making sure it's impactful and giving CARB the information that it needs, as well as the public. So that's our team, and I'll just for the sake of keeping things simple, I'll provide the voiceover for the next few slides, but they may jump in during Q&A. So if you can go ahead, Sarah, and advance to the next slide. We've got delineated the work that we've contracted with CARB kind of into 4 quick buckets here to describe what we're doing. The first task that we've just started on this summer is to use available data provided by CARB to characterize what's going on in the market, as well as to do a wide-ranging literature review and provide kind of a synthesis view of the state of the heavy-duty truck market as it pertains to issues of retiring older vehicles and encouraging the adoption of zero-emission vehicles in the future. So that's just kind of doing our homework, laying the groundwork, describing the state of the vehicle fleet in California from the available data, and making sure that we have scoured the earth looking for best practices and lessons learned elsewhere about how to think about some of these issues. And then we'll be moving on to 2 parallel analyses. One of them is to explore a wide range of policies in addition to just sort of the regulatory approaches that you're already familiar with and that ARB has already done a lot of modeling around and is developing, but to think about complementary market-based policies, what they might look like. Our goal is not to choose a policy or recommend a specific pathway, but rather to make sure we've looked and thought about lots of different options and offered a review of the strengths and benefits and potential impacts and distributional concerns related to a variety, as many different types of policies to accelerate retirement as possible, and to do the same for thinking about what kind of policies would encourage faster adoption of zero emission vehicles. And then we'll wrap that all up into a final report that we'll be delivering to the Air Resources Board. So I'll say just a little bit more about these tasks, and then we'll pause. So Sarah, if you could advance now. Thank you. So the market review that we've just started on is basically to use available data to characterize, how many of these older trucks are in the state right now and how they're being used, and to see to what extent we can use data to understand which types of firms, which what truck categories, which industries they're associated with, whether these are big or small firms, who's holding older trucks, and to get a sense of why those vehicles, where they are and how they're being used, as well as to understand kind of in recent years, both taking into account economic factors as well as regulations that are rolling out and having impacts on different parts of the fleet in differential ways, to understand rates of turnover or retirement of vehicles as they are today, and also to where there are green shoots and there's some small numbers of zero emission trucks that have been adopted to date, to kind of characterize where that's happening, although it's very early in the market, and to do a bit of characterization of where we expect to see more of those trucks, again, across these sorts of dimensions and why. Okay, so Sarah, if you could advance to the next one. So the kinds of I should emphasize that Sarah had a lot of preliminary results that are, and if those were preliminary, these are extremely preliminary. We've just gotten access to these data and are working with ARB on a regular basis to make sure we're understanding and interpreting them all correctly. But just to give you a flavor of some of the kinds of things that we can do, we're looking right now primarily at DMV records. And so we're looking at diesel vehicles that are over 14,000 pounds. And we're able to look at the registration records to characterize the distribution of how old are trucks in California. When you look at, this is an example of showing the age distribution of trucks that were registered in 2019. And when you look at this distribution, we put a couple red arrows there. You can see very clearly the historical legacy of recessions, where there aren't a whole lot of 10-year-old vehicles around in 2019 because there weren't a whole lot of new vehicles sold during 2009 due to economic factors. Also impacting these factors are going to be, of course, regulations that are rolled out and encourage retirement. And when we look at different sectors of or different vehicles registered in different purposes, as well as different truck types, you can see differences very clearly in the impact of regulation. So we'll be accounting for regulations and trying to suss out and understand and characterize where the vehicles that are being driven around California today, how old they are, where they look like in the age distribution, and how that is changing in recent years, given both economic factors and the rollout of policy. Okay, Sarah, can you advance again? And so there's a couple of just broad strokes, just to mention things we're doing with these data. One aspect is that we're actually able to follow individual vehicles and show how they show their life, because we can follow them through several years of registration data. So we can see transitions of an individual vehicle between different types of firms. We can see them starting in one role and shifting to other firms where those transitions occur. We can also simply look at the age distribution between different years. And so this graph is just overlaying that same graph before of model year this time, distribution of model year vehicles by in 2018 and 2019. And the differences between the heights of these two bars is an indicator of the sort of net inflow or outflow of vehicles of different ages. And so on the right, you can see that there are more 2019 vehicles registered that are labeled as 2019 or 2020 model year vehicles. That's not surprising. So that's a net addition of the newest vehicles. And then everywhere that there is kind of a visible blue or bar, it's a net reduction of the fleet between 2018 and 2019 of vehicles of those particular model years, which indicates movement of the fleet towards a newer vintages overall. And so we can use these types of data to understand the dynamics and model what's going on in the market in terms of retention and net replacement of vehicles of different ages, again, accounting for both economic phenomenon, the rollout of regulation, and of course, looking at these differences across industries and types of trucks, because here we're pooling together lots of very heterogeneous different types of vehicles that have different expected duty cycles and you would expect to have very different replacement and retirement retention patterns. We'll be doing work to dive in and look at all those differences across the visible characteristics that are included in registration records available to us. Okay, Sarah, if you want to advance forward. And so that's our market overview. It's just a sampling of the work that we've gotten started on this summer. And then again, this fall, we'll be transitioning to kind of the heart of our work, which is to think about all of the feasible policy options that an economist might imagine or dream up to think about accelerating retirement of older vehicles, taking care to assess the strengths and weaknesses of different approaches, right? So this involves looking at all existing policy ideas that have been out there and pushed, whether it's in California or in some other location, as well as trying to see if we can come up with some ideas that haven't been fleshed out in prior work. Our goal, and the list is the language that Mark or I would use to say is that we're trying to do a qualitative analysis, meaning that we're wanting to say in broad strokes, you know, what are the economic efficiency implications? What are the equity implications? And how effective would these different types of policies be? Taking care to think about how they interact with existing and proposed rules. And, you know, a significant output of this project would be to think about exactly what additional information is needed to do a real in-depth quantitative model that would translate a policy scenario into a forecast of emissions and economic costs for pursuing emissions reduction through different specific pathways. Sarah, if you could advance more, I'll just have 2 more slides here, I believe. So for example, just to give a flavor of the approach, at a very high level, if you want people to do more of A and less of B, then you need to make A relatively more attractive. You can make A relatively more attractive by making it better or by making the alternative that you don't want people to choose worse in some way. And so within that spirit, you can think of lots of different things you might do. You can simply make operating older vehicles more expensive. So one way to think about that is to use vintage-based registration fees. That can also, again, be specific to other categories as well that can interact with class type, of course, and even region of registration potentially. You can imagine doing that through fuel taxes, or you can imagine doing it through some sort of usage based fee, meaning a policy that's you know, where registration fees are specific and tied to how many miles a vehicle is accruing in a given year. Of course, you can also just make it more attractive to turn over your fleet by subsidizing retirement rather than by taxing the vehicles. And so to an economist, these are 2 sides of the same coin, and we'll be exploring the implications of pursuing each of them distinctly. You can also restrict the use of older vehicles to be in specific locations or purposes or mileage, for example, through low emission zones where air pollution is most concerning, to restrict the use of different particular types of vehicles, potentially by vintage. And of course, we can just make newer vehicles more appealing. So we can make them better and we can make them less expensive through subsidies or other policies. One thing to note is, even if we talk about taxing older vehicles or something like that, it doesn't have to imply a net outflow of revenue. It doesn't have to, because these can be structured in lots of different ways. You could imagine, for example, using registration fees that are used to fund a pool of resources that can be used to buy out and offer subsidies for retirement. So we can have carrots and sticks that go together that neutralize any net collection of revenue from the industry. And so we'll be thinking about all those kinds of issues. And again, one of the challenges for us as economists to model this is to think of all the nuanced ways in which existing regulations that are rolling out over time would interact with the different types of policy ideas. Okay, and again, I just want to emphasize, I'm talking about all of this at a high level, but of course, there's no reason why you'd pursue these things without potentially considering different levels of differentiation, of treating different class vehicles quite differently, and making a considerable scope for exemptions and exceptions for different types of vehicles based on different considerations. And so we'll be trying to fold as much of that into our analysis as possible. But again, the focus is on providing as broad a menu as possible to think about what these policy options are and what their strengths and weaknesses are of each. Okay, so if you can advance forward, I'll be brief on this slide because I'll just summarize that we want to kind of do the exact same thing, but on the zero emission truck side. So everything I've been saying before was focused on this issue of trying to see opportunities to encourage retirement of older vehicles, but the converse of that is to encourage zero emission truck adoption. And so we'll be doing the same process of trying to explore and understand the policy ideas that are already out there, explore and articulate alternative ones, and assess the strengths and weaknesses of those as market-based policies that would complement or interact with the more traditional regulatory approaches that simply mandate fleet movements over time and schedule those in. So I think the next slide is just a reminder or a sense of our timeline. We've just gotten to work on the first task, and we'll be exploring throughout this next 6 to 9 months the other aspects of the report, and be delivering some sort of a draft report by this time next year for iteration and review with our to Sarah and others there at ARB. I think that's our last slide, and that's I imagine we'll be on a question slide now. So thanks for listening.
Yes, you're opening it to questions, and here again are the directions for doing that.
All right, so there is a couple questions in the Q&A, so let's start there. The first one is, FYI, slide 35 is missing a label for the salmon color, which they said they presume is the model year 2020. So maybe we can just confirm that, and maybe we can pull up that slide again.
Yeah, I think that slide was showing two different histograms, but where they overlap, they create a third color.
Yep.
And so it's the, yeah, so in this one, there are two distributions, and where they are overlapping with each other, there's like a transparency idea, and you'll get that darker, that darker burgundy color. Somebody who's better color palette can let me know what the right term there is. Magenta, maybe. And the salmon color indicates that there were more registrations of that vintage in 2019 than there were in 2018. And of course, in which vehicles are there going to be a lot more of in 2019? It's going to be, well, 2020 labeled vehicles that were registered in things that were labeled by the manufacturer as a 2020 model year will there won't be very many of them, if any, in 2018, but there will be some in 2019, and there'll be many more 2019 registered vehicles. So you see those newest vehicles where there's a salmon color means there's more of them in 2019 than 2018, as you'd expect. And then likewise, as you expect, looking back at say 2020, you know, there's the overlapping area, that height indicates how many there were in 2019, and then the gap, the area that's just blue is indicating that there were even more in 2018. And so the difference between the two that's just colored blue flow reduction of model year vehicles between those 2 years.
Okay, great. So let's move on. The next question is from Bill McGavern. Can you break out the post-useful life trucks by what percentage are in fleets of 50 and more and over, sorry. And then also what data do you have, also what data do you use to verify which trucks have reached 800,000 miles? So 2 questions there.
I will
Sarah,
take
do you want to take that?
Yes. Yeah, so that's a really great question about, you know, the data and the modeling methods we're using to kind of break this all out. For the zero emission truck measure, we considered vehicles that are not regulated by advanced clean fleets, because by 2037, for example, ACF basically converts like the vast majority of those like larger 50+ fleets to zero emission. And so what's left over is mostly these like the smaller fleets that are not subject to ACF. So that's kind of like what we're focusing on, and I kind of break all of that out in the bar charts I showed earlier. As for the like accrual assumptions or odometer assumptions, we use Caltrans's survey data, also known as CalBIAS, which was a massive survey they undertook, and fleets reported annual mileage and also odometer. So we have really great data on odometer by age. And so that's what we're using. And if we discover any other data sources we can use to improve our analysis, we will certainly do that. And if you have suggestions on other data sources we can use, we're always open to that as well. Thank you for your question.
Okay, so we have 2 more questions in the Q&A, but I'm going to go back to those ones after we take a couple hands. I see that Damon Conklin hand is raised. I'm not sure if that was a holdover from the last one, but I will unmute you now, Damon. Okay, we will move on. I'm going to move on to Will Barrett. I've allowed you to talk and you can unmute yourself now.
Thank you very much. This is Will Barrett. I'm the National Senior Director for Clean Air Advocacy with the American Lung Association. And first of all, I wanted to say thank you for the discussion and presentations today. And I'd really like to associate my comments with those of Mr. McGavern with the Coalition for Clean Air. As far as CARB really should be looking at this retirement issue as a higher priority, taking actions on the rulemaking more quickly, because as we saw on slide 23, or 25, sorry, I think the huge benefits that will follow from addressing these oldest, dirtiest vehicles and moving them out of service as quickly as possible. So I just wanted to start there. We at the Lung Association work closely with Coalition for Clean Air to really push and explain the urgency of this approach, and as part of the SIP discussion, and we're really pleased to see the conversation has evolved into what we expect to see in the draft SIP when that comes out, that this will be a measure that will be actionable by the agency. For all of the public health reasons that we've talked about, we just again want to state how urgent it is to be looking at these older vehicles and appreciate the conversation. I have just really clarifying question for Dr. Sally. And again, thank you for walking through the approach that you'll be taking. I think one of the main question I have is will the analysis provide this kind of explanation of the no new authorities option that was contained in one of the earlier slides? Essentially, SB1 set the parameters for useful life. CARB has the authority to act on those parameters now. And while there are the other options being explored and analyzed, we'd really like to make sure that going forward, we see that analyzed in the approach as well. Basically, CARB using its existing authority to enact, a retirement program across the board. So that's my question. And again, thank you all for the presentation and discussion today.
Great, thanks. I think key in our characterization of the strengths and weaknesses of different approaches would be whether they require additional legislation or appear to be under existing authority. So, the way that I think about our task as outside economists here to model policy is to think we want to list all the policies. We're going to say we think this one's more economically efficient, this one's more, but it's the biggest burden will be on these types of users, and another characteristic will be that appears to be under, viable under existing rules, or we think it would require the following additional authority. And so I just think of it as we're trying to explore all the options and assess their strengths and benefits. But one of those things is certainly going to be whether it whether it require additional action or fall under existing rules. So.
Thank you for that. And I just, I do appreciate that. It's an incredibly important element of all of this discussion. And I think again, the clear policy of once you hit these thresholds that are in SB1, CARB can regulate. I think that without new authority, I think that's really a baseline that should be included. So I appreciate the explanation. Thank you.
Okay, we can move on to our next question. I'm going to go back to the Q&A box. We have a comment from Mark Cuesta. It is, realize we all greatly embrace the ZET rule, but would there be a low use exemption? Just a general comment. I presume truck stops along routes would need to upgrade their infrastructure to support electric trucks. Do we want to say anything about this comment, or are we just gonna note that for later?
I can address this. Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Bruce.
All right, sorry. I was just going to say I can address the second half, the general comment. And Mark, yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Public charging is going to be critical in this space. We do already see a number of large truck stop companies that are at least looking into things such as funding and so forth to do just that. There are also new companies. One you may have heard of is a company called Watt EV. They are beginning to install some zero emission charging, including one location near the port of Long Beach, I believe it is. Again, they're small, they're starting, but my understanding is those stations are supposed to be finished soon. You've probably heard about some of the major truck manufacturers committing hundreds of millions of dollars to putting in charging around the country, not just in California. So again, your comment is spot on, and we are seeing that folks are starting to address that. Thank you.
And I can maybe chime in a little bit on the first part. That when we think about exemptions and other things about how to make these future policies implement, we'll definitely be considering that as part of the whatever upcoming rulemaking we work on, but it's still very early for that, and we still need to figure out what the best approach even in the rulemaking would be. I'm done.
Okay, so our next question, or actually we'll go back to a hand raised. So I will turn it over to Glenn Cho. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Glenn Cho from Toyota Motors North America. Dr. Sally, I had a couple of questions. On your slide 34, I believe the base of data that's solely be used for the study is the DMV data. Is that correct?
That is certainly the primary data source. We have some additional types of things. You know, we're using pollution data that comes through the MFAC model. We'll be using the mileage, the mileage by age information that Sarah was describing previously. We'll also be looking to see if there's any national data that is a useful complement. But essentially, the best picture we have for characterizing the current distribution of vehicles is within this DMV records. So presumably you have a follow-up question related to that, but I'll just emphasize that the policy modeling that we're going to do after the fact, you know, is going to be relying not so much on these data per se. These data are useful for characterizing the existing market. They're useful for directing our attention to say where are there potentially more impactful actions to take, and how might we think at a high level about how impactful they will be. But most of the policy exploration is based on economic modeling that is, you know, inspired by these data, but not necessarily constrained by their limitations, if that makes sense.
No, it does. Our insight into this is that we do recognize that many of the trucks are actually registered in Oregon and Indiana for various tax reasons. And so a lot of trucks that we see in California are not registered in California, are actually registered. A big chunk of them are registered in Oregon or that of Indiana. So that's why we want to kind of raise that point up, that perhaps the data set may it's not going to be complete, but it's good enough. But it's just that there's a lot of trucks out there that we see that are not registered in California that's on the road today. And then the other slide I want to ask about was related to the retirement of older vehicle in task 2. You know, in your analysis, we presume that it's solely focused on the truck side, but we're wondering if there's an analysis intended for the business side. A lot of larger businesses are in California. And we do believe they're the ones who's going to drive the zero emission truck market because they're the early adopters and the ones the ACF regulation seems to be targeting. So is there some focus that's going to be planned for the businesses that operate in California to encourage or to spur their adoption of these zero emission trucks? That's another question we had. And then the last comment I'll make is really for the CARB staff. It would be great had we had done this study that align with the Advanced Clean Fleet Rule, and seeing I'm very unfortunate that the Advanced Clean Fleet Rule is going to happen, and this study is going to come later. It's just kind of timing, I guess, is not most aligned. Is kind of what we observe. So thank you.
Does anybody want to jump in on anything?
Yes, regarding the comment about ACF and, you know, how all of this is going to fit together. I know that you're, you know, working closely with Jim and other folks to make sure that, you know, whatever kind of policies we explore, you know, account for the regulations that CARB already has in place, and, you know, the many factors involved in that. Does anyone else want to chime in?
Well, let me just say one thing about the task 2. We would really appreciate if the study could encompass how to spur businesses to adopt this. I see this study solely focused on the regulatory mechanism related to SB1, but there's other economic incentives out there that can spur businesses to adopt these trucks. And just again, if you take the Rogers innovation curve that we all recognize, it's the early adopters for the zero emission vehicle market that spur the light duty side. We do believe such mechanism could play a role in the heavy duty market as well. And we do recognize that it's the larger businesses out there, if they're given some incentives to do this, to make quick turnaround of fleets, use trucks into the market for smaller businesses to acquire, I think that would spur also greater market penetration. Thank you.
Yeah, we're aiming to be very expansive in what we consider as policies I didn't have a companion slide fleshing out the more details on the zero emission truck side. I provided them greater detail comparatively on the retirement of older truck side, but that is very much, I think what we have in mind to execute later this year and into the spring is very much in line with what you were suggesting, which is to emphasize where is there potential adoption, what policy levers would accelerate that. And I think I'm not totally certain if would semantically make the same distinction about, you know, encouraging trucks versus companies, but I think the way you're using the language is I think what you mean is totally consistent with what we have in mind. So we want to know there's only a few of these zero emission trucks registered today, but we can see where they are, what types of use cycles, what kinds of companies are adopting them. Of course, lots of companies have placed orders for vehicles that haven't shown up yet or turned into the fleet, but have nominally placed orders for many more vehicles. And we can see what kinds of companies those are, who those early adopters are, and ask where might subsidies or additional policies, encouragement have the biggest bang for the buck. That's precisely what we're trying to understand.
Thank you.
Okay, are we ready to move on to the next question? Okay, cool. So our next question will be a question that was put in the Q&A box. It says timelines are still not clear. How does interface with ACT, and what is the target number of ZEV vehicles under the ZET?
Okay, that's a great question. So the Advanced Clean Trucks rule is a manufacturer sales requirement for zero emission trucks. So it's kind of different from some of the other, regulatory efforts we talked about, like advanced completes, which is, requirement for at the fleet level, not for manufacturers. And then the zero emission truck measure, which would start in 2028. So ACT and ACF, I believe, would be starting in 2024. Our rulemaking folks can confirm. And then in 2030, that is like the set date for the zero emission truck measure, or the tentative set date. So that's kind of how those things fit together. And of course, the zero emission truck measure is still, we're going to be exploring, how it kind of layers into or on top of all of our other regulations. And so that's kind of a big part of what this report will be exploring over the next year. And the target number of zero emission vehicles, I mean, we carved out basically in the inventory all vehicles that are beyond their useful life. And sorry, I don't have the exact number on me, but that was the criteria basically for the vehicles that we modeled the retirement of and conversion to zero emission. So the target wasn't number of ZEVs per se, but rather whether or not they are past their useful life. And Paul, do you have any additional comments?
I guess I just add that when we're looking at the transitioning the medium and heavy duty sector to zero emissions, we are looking at a portfolio of policies, as you mentioned. All these are capable of standing on their own. Advanced clean trucks as a manufacturer rule, advanced clean fleets as a fleet rule, and the upcoming zero emission truck measure. So they're all separate, but we're trying to design them so they all work together to create a cohesive policy framework to transition as many trucks as possible to zero emission. So that's kind of the overall how we intend for them to interface together.
All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next raised hand is Bill McGavran. I will unmute you now.
Yeah, hey, sorry to raise my hand again, but I wanted to clarify my written question because I didn't hear an answer to it. The question is, when you project the trucks that will reach the end of their useful lives, what percentage of those are in the category of fleets of 50 and over?
So sorry about that. Yeah, so I was kind of when we're modeling, this useful life scenario, I'm kind of leaving the advanced clean fleets trucks alone because those are going to be turned over to zero emission and they're already regulated. So focusing on the fleet groups that are not. But if you look at the fleet as a whole and vehicles that are combustion that are over their useful life, after advanced clean fleets, which converts a lot of most of those regulated fleets to zero emission, most of what you have left are smaller fleets. But I don't have the exact percentage. I can certainly follow up with you and get you those numbers if you're interested.
Yeah, I am interested. Thank you very much for that. And also, the final report pursuant to SB1, will that go to the board on an agenda?
Currently, we do not have a board item planned for that, but you will see in the next steps that I'm going to be going through soon that we're going to have another workshop happening next summer or fall timeframe in 2023 for additional feedback and comments once we have a lot of the work more fleshed out and some results to show everyone.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so we'll go back to the Q&A now, and our next question is, what about minerals needed for BEVs?
I can hop onto this one. This is Paul Raja on the Advanced Fleets team again. So just to get started, when we're looking at any of these rulemakings for zero emission, we do try to identify what the environmental impacts will be and describe that in our environmental analysis, which is part of our overall notice packet and staff report. So we do try to identify what the potential impacts would be, where they would occur. So we are going to be looking at potential increased mining of minerals for BEVs and the potential impact associated with that. And just another thing that we want to be clear on, for all the stuff we're talking about with zero emission truck measures, we're talking about both battery electric and fuel cell vehicles. So we see that battery electric vehicles are one path, fuel cells are another path, and they both have different impacts. Just something important to keep in mind. And I'll pass off to Bruce who has some additional thoughts.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, just a couple other things. And, Paul did mention, of course, there's the issue of mining minerals. A couple things on that point, however. One of those being that the recycling of minerals out of those batteries are going to be pretty critical. And one thing that I want to note is that there are companies in the US that are starting to look at recycling those batteries, and at least in one case I know they have a pretty good, I think a pretty good, well, they've tried to minimize the environmental impact as much as possible. They basically do all of the actual mineral extraction at one point where they can much better control any pollution issues. But so that is one of the things that we will see more and more of is recycling of those batteries. The other thing I think we'll see more and more of is the reuse of older batteries. We're already seeing that. I mentioned one of the companies that's installing zero emission charging stations. At least in one of their stations, they have not only solar on site, but they have battery backup on site, and all of the battery backup that they have is used batteries. It's important to know that the batteries that go into a truck or a car or whatever, they reach a useful life of, I believe it's around 80 or 70 or 80%, something like that. And once they won't charge past that, they start becoming less useful for the vehicle itself. That doesn't mean that there's not a use for them outside of the vehicle. And again, a number of folks are looking at different ways. I think we all recognize that battery storage, not just for this space of vehicles, but for grid stability and a number of other things is going to be really critical. So again, people are looking at ways to minimize the environmental impacts all the way around. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll go back to our raised hands. The next person is Laurel Moorhead. I have unmuted you.
Hi, I'm Laurel and I represent Transfer Flow, and we manufacture fuel systems. We've been in California for 40 years, and I appreciate the work that CARB does, but I think there's a couple shortcomings with the regulations in general. And one, I think that when we focus only on tailpipe emissions, we don't take into account the entire life cycle emissions of the vehicle, both the mining of the batteries, the creation of the batteries, the creation of the electricity, and the transporting the electricity to the charging stations. So all of that has its own carbon footprint attached. And so when we define all internal combustion engines based on the performance of petroleum fuels, then we're really undercutting ourselves a lot. And one of the best ways to make new vehicles more appealing to consumers is to give consumers a variety of near zero choices that they can choose from. And I would like to encourage CARB staff to work more closely with CARB's low carbon fuel standard branch, because they've done a lot of research over the years about renewable diesel and renewable compressed natural gas. And renewable natural gas is carbon negative because they create it from agricultural waste that would otherwise create more carbon disposing of it than it is created to turn it into fuel. But this isn't being allowed under these new regulations. And waste management companies are already doing this. They're sequestering the compost out of your waste and keeping it out of landfills, turning it into renewable natural gas, and then running their dump trucks on it. But and they should not be forced to give that up to contain an electric battery when they are completely self-contained already, creating their own fuel locally, making good paying jobs doing it. And I know people say, oh, well, all internal combustion engines make NOx, which is true, but NOx reduction technologies such as EGRs and variable valve timing have never been used on natural gas vehicles because they are inherently extremely low NOx. They naturally create less NOx than the new proposed standards for plug-in hybrids. And we've never put NOx control technologies on them. So I think we need to look at close to zero emission vehicles, near zero technologies, and those also need to be included. There's a lot of applications where electric just isn't a good solution, like emergency vehicles or rural applications or utility vehicles. We currently have a contract with the federal government to mount 800 diesel fuel tanks on electric vehicles to run large diesel generators because California is doing away with gasoline vehicles or diesel vehicles, and it just doesn't make sense. Another example is that we could have a 90% immediate reduction in diesel emissions if we used renewable diesel instead of petroleum diesel. It's a drop in fuel. You don't have to require people to switch out their fleets. And then it's compatible. Like I've got a public comment from Mexico right here that says, just because California is making everything going all electric doesn't mean that we are going to have the infrastructure. And how do you expect for truckers crossing the borders at Oda Mesa and Tijuana to be able to comply? And so that's, I'd really like you to please look into the low carbon fuel standards. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Laurel. Yeah, we do work closely with, folks in our low carbon fuel standard branch or branches. And yeah, we'll definitely, track that as we go through the process. Just some comments on, the optional low NOx. Yeah. They can have significantly lower NOx emissions, than those 2010 certified diesel engines. However, from the data we've seen, the real world emissions benefits of these technologies can be somewhat limited or uncertain because by their in-use performance, which is often higher than the certification standard, and then also emissions control systems for all combustion technology can certainly deteriorate over time and lead to higher emissions than their certified standards as well. And so we have all these upcoming air quality targets and an immediate need for
to maximize emissions reductions. So, you know, 100% reduction in tailpipe emissions is, you know, really key and central for meeting our air quality goals. And yeah, but thank you for your comment. It's very, and all the details you included. Any other CARB folks want to chime in?
I can just add a little bit. We do evaluate upstream emissions as part of our rulemaking processes. And when we're looking at upstream emissions, I guess first on the zero emission side, we do factor that in. What we do see also is that for California specifically, we have policies to clean up our electricity grid significantly. I believe the goal is 100% zero carbon emissions by 2045, and the grid's already today significantly renewable. So that's currently in process. We know more work needs to be done, but the grid has been significantly cleaned up and continues to do so. And what we do recognize, we have implemented policies to support these low carbon fuels, and I mean we have supported them throughout and are continuing to support them through our low carbon fuel standard policy regulations. I think one thing we're trying to figure out as part of our overall CARB strategy is the best use. We know there's renewable natural gas. It is a low carbon fuel source, but there's a lot of places we use natural gas, and trying to identify the best use is critical to this. And that's something we're trying to figure out a lot more through our scoping plan process. And other policies are already coming out, such as the Public Utility Commission's recent decision that natural gas providers have to start procuring renewable natural gas. So we know that's a good source, but there's a limited amount of it, and there's a lot of places we want to put it. So where there are options for zero emission fuels, that's another part of the overall equation. So just some additional stuff to include there.
Okay, so I don't see any other hands raised at this time. So we'll go back to our Q&A box. I see a comment from Leonard Seitz. The slides focus on registrations, but older trucks get much less usage, both in miles and in loads. That idea should be considered in policy discussions. MFAC will address usage. Off-road usage of old trucks is another issue, especially if they never get on the road and are not registered.
Okay, yeah, so that's a great question and comment, Leonard, and yes, thank you very much. So we do account for you know, differences in accrual by age in MFAC. Kind of going back to that Caltrans survey data, CalVias, we do have annual accrual data by age. And yes, we do see that, you know, as trucks get older, they tend to drive less per year. And so this is something we account for in our modeling efforts, and it's very key to do that. So that's a great comment. And then off-road usage is not something we keep track of in on-road emissions inventory. Like if there's a vehicle that's not registered, then we don't really consider it. I don't really know how many of those vehicles are really out there, if it's just a handful, but it's something we'll keep in mind as we go through the analysis. Thank you for that.
All right, and then there's another question. It's just saying, what about the Mexico comment? They're saying that was not addressed. So if we want to address that right now.
Yeah, so is this about IRP not having Mexico? And if it is, what I mentioned last time, and yeah, feel free to raise your hand for maybe to add additional details, but yeah, most of the trucks coming over the California border from Mexico that are Mexican trucks have two plates. So they have Mexico plates and California plates. And those California plates are something we can link to our California DMV.
And I'll address that, Stum. Yeah, we've actually been working with the Otay Mesa Chamber of Commerce quite a bit on some of these issues. You know, so you know, I'm familiar with what they brought up about the, south of the border, the Mexican side of the border. We would anticipate that just like on the northern side, if there's a need there, then someone will be working, very, very strongly to try and fill that need. A lot of the trucks there that come across, they travel from the border up to only about as far at the most as the ports of LA and Long Beach, around 120 miles or so. There will be a need for charging there. Many of the trucks that come across the border only come across into California for about 20 miles, I believe the limit is. There's different permits that a truck gets. So, whether or not they will even need to charge on the southern side of the border, I think is an issue. Also, and I think Olivia, I'll save you going through the questions, I guess, because the next question I think was going to come to me anyway. The comment was California doesn't have the electrical infrastructure now as demonstrated by flex alerts, rolling blackouts. How is the state grid going to support the proliferation of EVs? My mouth's not working. So first of all, there is a great deal of work that's being done right now at a state level as well as at the private level. That's really the CEC is the lead agency on that. They're working with CPUC. We're working with them all the time. They're working with, as I said, private companies to plan for these needs. One of the big things that people, I think, need to look at too is it's not just about generating power or even transporting power. And the generation of power isn't the biggest issue or the big issue. We can generate and or import, just like we would with fossil fuels, electricity, and we don't have a real shortage of generation and input. It's the transportation of that electricity that's the bigger problem. So first of all, there's that. But then things that are being looked at, there's a lot of work on making the grid more stable that's being done. So it's not just even about getting the power somewhere, it's about moving maybe those generation points, to localize them more. Microgrids, battery storage, huge battery storage projects are going in around the state. And all of that is designed to take pressure off the grid. And you may also have heard of vehicle to grid integration. That is being that technology is maturing all the time. The very vehicles that are charging on the grid may well help solve some of that grid stability issue. So thank you.
All right, so we have one more question in the Q&A box. I'll read it now from Laurel Moorhead. How does creating electricity from renewable natural gas, transporting the electricity to the charging station, and charging the vehicle using the electricity created from renewable natural gas create less emissions than putting the renewable natural gas directly into the vehicle?
I can try and pick up part of that at least again. One of the things that Paul mentioned, and I think that's really important to keep in mind here, California's grid is getting cleaner all the time. As I recall, AB 32 required a 33% reduction in carbon intensity from the grid by 2020. We actually not only met that, but we met it in 2017 or 2018. So we met it early. Right now, I believe we're around 40% renewable already. It was mentioned that there's a statewide mandate to go to zero at some point, but I think it's really important. There are already electrical utilities out there that have commitments to become, completely decarbonized by, 2030, 2035. So first of all, there's that piece. And I know that a lot of the studies that I've seen look at the national power grid, and that's really apples to oranges to California's power grid. So that really shouldn't be the way to look at it. The other piece, is talks about how does it create fewer emissions? Well, again, if you are creating that hydrogen, let's say, if you're creating that hydrogen with completely renewable energy, and you're not doing something like methane steam reforming, you're using you're using completely clean electricity. I think that's where the cleaner emissions would come in. So I will stop there. Thank you.
And I think it's also important to note that, like, in addition to Bruce's comments, that, you know, the low NOx engines can deteriorate over time, or, you know, with different duty cycles, they can often have higher emissions in their certification standards. And this is still really, you know, important for regional air quality and meeting the SIP, the ozone targets, and particulate matter. But then also it's very key for, you know, community exposure, especially, you know, if deterioration results in more particulate matter, for example. So yeah, these are all things we'll continue to keep in mind. Thank you. And it looks like we have one more question.
Yeah, so I see there's actually two more comments or questions in the Q&A. So the next one is, why RNG into grid or as feedstock for hydrogen? Because electric drivetrains for heavy duty vehicles are up to 5 times more efficient than ICE vehicles. Would we like to comment on that, or should we move on to the next one?
Hey, yeah, we'll go ahead and if no one else on the panel has any comments, we will go ahead and record that comment. Thank you.
Okay. And then the next one is also leaking pipelines and distribution infrastructure for natural gas. So those are the last two comments in the Q&A. So Sarah, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, thank you very much. And if you are an anonymous attendee, it would be really awesome if you could, you know, state your name and also your affiliation. That would be really helpful for us while we're keeping records of all the great questions you all are asking. All right. So am I the host again?
No, I can hand it back over to you if we're done with questions.
Yeah.
1 minute. Okay, you should have control again.
Okay, so just moving on to this last part here, this will be pretty quick. So we're just going to go over, you know, next steps for this project. Today we kind of covered, you know, preliminary results and a snapshot of our understanding of things now in terms of, you know, air quality and truck and bus compliance rates. So here we're going to talk about, you know, where we're headed next on this effort. So here's the proposed timeline. We had our workshop today, and then on November 30th, 2022, we're going to be taking comments, or we'll have comments in before then, and you can send the comments to my email address here. It's just my first and last name at arb.ca.gov. And then we plan to have a second workshop early fall 2023 timeframe, and then fall 2023 is when we're aiming to have the final report. So I would like to first recap feedback we received so far at the Zero Emission Trucks listening session that our folks in our Mobile Source Control Division hosted a couple of weeks ago. And some of the recommendations and comments that we received includes improved availability of infrastructure and zero emission fueling network, including public charging, a need for state policy to ensure all cities, counties, and state agencies are standardizing infrastructure planning. So this is a kind of a general comment to collaborate, making funding and incentives available for the purchase of zero emission trucks, including enough to cover any rising prices, an increase in manufacturer production or promoting this of these heavy duty zero emission vehicles to lower prices, And then finally, attendees at the listening session also brought up green zones, which we kind of talked about briefly earlier on, stacking of incentive funds, and then dedicated zero emission truck freight lanes. So yeah, we really appreciate that feedback we received. This to kind of give you an idea of like what we're considering so far. And then for this meeting and this effort, and again, you can send your comments to my email. We would really like any feedback or comments on the scope of the SB1 report or heavy duty programs in general. So this could include, so this isn't an exhaustive list, just to give you some ideas. Which strategies could CARB explore to encourage adoption of zero emission trucks? Are there any additional data sources available to assess compliance or impacts of non-compliance on meeting air quality goals? And then finally, what additional analyses should we perform to respond to the direction of SB1? Here's some contact information here. There's my information. And again, please send your comments to that email address. And then there's also my voice over IP line. And then we also have some other folks from our Mobile Source Control Division, Jennifer Gray, Adam Gomez from our Enforcement Division, and then Jim Salee, who presented earlier today. And at the very bottom, you can find all the materials that were the presentation that was shown today during today's workshop, as well as any other materials related to this effort. You can find that here at arb.ca.gov/SB1 report, and there are some dashes in there. And I will open it up for additional comments or questions if you have any last minute ones before we end. But I want to say that we really appreciate your active participation, and we're really excited to continue this effort and synthesize the results in a report. Thank you.
All right, so we do have a couple comments in the Q&A. They're both from Veronica Pardo. So the first one is, we need to also consider needed growth of the grid. Rahinder stated 7.7 gigawatts needed year over year for next 22 years. And then they also added, we need to also consider needed growth of the grid. Rahinder stated, wait, this is the same comment, never mind. So Bruce, did you want to talk to this comment?
Just quickly, and I don't have the numbers. I know that just recently I did read something about a great deal of renewables. I want to say it was around a gigawatt or more that has already been approved for funding over the next few years. Obviously something that, that is known, that, there's going to be a significant need for growth in the grid. But one thing I think that's really important to to note, some work by Lawrence Berkeley Labs. They participated in a forum that we put on about a year ago, and some work that they did and they provided at that forum showed that it's really the growth in the grid, the necessary growth in the grid is not unprecedented at all. They went back and analyzed the growth in the grid during things such as the 70s and 80s, saw a growth rate at that point, an average annual growth rate of around 3 or 3.2%. The projected growth rate over this period of time that we're talking about for California was somewhere around 2.5%. Maybe not a perfect comparison, but again, the point here is that growth is not unprecedented in our history or even close to it. So, and as I said earlier, there's a lot of folks in the utilities and at the state level that are working on meeting that need. Thank you.
All right, so we do have one hand raised. Laurel Moorhead, I've allowed you to talk.
Hi, thank you again. I wanted to respond to the last response from Bruce and Sarah, where Bruce said, well, the grid is always getting cleaner, and Sarah said, well, ICEs deteriorate. Well, vehicle technologies are also always getting cleaner, and your power generation plants also deteriorate and need maintenance and upgrades and stuff. And so all of those arguments can be played both ways around. And it doesn't address the limitations of electric vehicles, like people that you need utility vehicles and rural applications and stuff. And so that's why putting renewable natural gas into vehicles should be a one of the methods going forward. Thank you.
I'll just quickly address that. I think the first 2 points that Laurel made really don't necessarily apply here. One of the comments was that power plants degrade. That's very true. But as we go to renewables, you don't have that same kind of degradation problem. So I would disagree with that premise. Vehicles are getting cleaner, absolutely. But only zero emission vehicles are just that, zero emissions. So I also would say that, you know, there's a place for all of the vehicles at the moment, but those are the things that we have to look at. Thank you.
Okay, it doesn't look like we have any more questions in the Q&A box or any hands raised. Sarah, I will hand it back over to you.
Thanks, Olivia. And yes, just want to conclude the workshop by saying, yeah, thanks again for all your comments. And yes, obviously email any of us if you have, you know, any other ideas of things we can look into, and any other ideas of the types of analyses we can do. Okay, so I hope everyone has a great day, and we will be having another chance to talk about this next fall, as I mentioned. Okay, goodbye.